One of the most common things I've heard from people learning Japanese is that they could know all of the words in a sentence and understand exactly how the structure and the particles work, but still not grasp the meaning at all. So they might even think they understand it because all the words seem familiar, but when they check the translation of it, it's completely different. So today I'm going to explain why I think this is so common and what you can actually do about it to go from, well, I guess my Japanese just sucks today, to being able to enjoy what you're doing instead. Now, like I said, this is actually very common, and I think the problem comes down to how people traditionally have been taught to learn languages. So chances are, if you're trying to learn a language on your own, then you've probably already had some sort of experience learning a language, either in a class or by using textbooks or something like Duolingo. So the problem is that learning the language requires you to actually immerse and be comfortable with not understanding. In other words, learning to tolerate ambiguity. If you've ever taken some kind of formal class, then you know that the goal is usually to perfectly understand everything, which usually comes from translating it into your native language, and then the teacher will grade it. But the thing with this is literal translation doesn't always work for Japanese. Trying to translate the sentence into your native language and then understand your translation will usually fail because of how the meaning is conveyed differently. This is why I heavily advise against using English subs, because they're not actually translating the meaning. It's more based on trying to translate the context, which you should be trying to pick up naturally. Just knowing the vocabulary and the words isn't going to be sufficient enough. You have to actually combine that with the context of the sentence to understand what's going on. So for example, saying, "I'm so hungry I could eat a horse," doesn't mean that you're going to eat a horse, but it just means that you're so hungry that you could eat something as big as a horse. So for a Japanese example, you may look at the word harikiru and see the kanjis for lengthen and cut, but the meaning of harikiru isn't to lengthen something and then cut it. Instead, it actually means to be enthusiastic or to be in high spirits. Another example is the phrase suji ga toru, where there's the kanji for muscle and then there's the kanji for pass through. Now, the meaning isn't for something to hurt you and to pierce through your muscle. It just means that something makes sense. Now, usually for people having this problem, they also aren't paying attention enough to the context of the sentence, like I said before. That's also why I recommend watching anime with Japanese subs, just because you get the context from the show, you can read what they're saying in Japanese, and then you can hear them too. Now, part of the problem in learning this way is that you've been taught to treat the language like a math problem instead of a language. So let me explain. Depending on how much Japanese you've been exposed to up to this point, you've probably come across the passive forms of verbs, meaning that the subject receives the action. For example, kotowaru becomes kotowarareru and iu becomes iwareru. Now, you don't have to understand any of that to get what I'm saying here. It's just that the main point is for a lot of people, when they learn these forms, they'll spend a lot of time doing grammar drills or practicing to get them down, which isn't necessarily bad, but it essentially gets you in the habit of overanalyzing a sentence when you see it. Like when a sentence is like, this is mirareru, which is the passive form of miru. So that means the passive agent of the sentence. Like, no, a lot of you guys tend to just think that a sentence is literally what the words are saying, but it's not. Now, back to the point about treating the language like a math problem. By trying to 100% capture the entire meaning and literally translate it to your native language in your head, not only is it super slow, but it also just doesn't really make a lot of sense. Languages are not at all logical by nature. In fact, they're the opposite. Grammar is just our way as humans of trying to attempt to explain all the rules in a language to make it logical. But no matter how many rules you try to memorize, the language is still going to be illogical. So even if you try to learn all the patterns depending on the words, there's still like 5 different ways to say something depending on the context. If you need more proof, then just look up Keigo. For example, I was learning Polish a few years back with some more traditional methods, and while Japanese is a language that has a fair amount of grammar rules, Polish has way more exceptions than grammar rules. Like the word for man, which is mężczyzna, is treated as a feminine noun despite being a masculine noun and literally meaning man. So while you can attempt to solve the language like an equation, languages are illogical by nature and rely on context, which makes understanding hard when you overanalyze it. So just knowing all the meanings of a word also is not enough to understand. You also need to know the context surrounding the sentence to know how the words are relevant to the actual meaning. This is why it's also generally a bad idea to learn words outside of context. Because, for example, the words kaihatsu and tenkai both essentially mean development according to a dictionary, but the nuance is still different. So you would use kaihatsu when developing something new that involves innovation, like the sentence "Atarashii apuri o kaihatsu suru," which means to develop a new app. On the contrary, tenkai is talking about development in the context of expanding something that's already being developed, like "Jigyo o kaigai ni tenkai suru," meaning to expand a business overseas. So what do I think the solution is? The short answer is to just immerse with more comprehensible input for where your skill level actually is. The reason immersion is going to help you with this is because it relies heavily on being in the flow of what's happening and then using the context that's being given to you. So for example, if you're watching a video of someone walking through Japan, speaking Japanese with Japanese subtitles on the screen, and then they suddenly see a spider and jump back and yell, ah, kumo, then it's pretty obvious that they're afraid of the spider and that the kumo is the spider. Now, that's a very basic example of how immersion will help you, so let me explain it a bit more. When you're immersing, whether it's easy content like a beginner YouTube channel or if it's some isekai anime, there's always going to be a lot of basic sentences like the kumo one that you will naturally understand. But you clicked on this video to understand the sentences where you can understand basically everything, but it still doesn't click anyway. Now, if you truly understood everything, then it would click. So clearly there's some part or multiple parts of the sentence that you haven't mastered yet. The truth is, if the sentence was comprehensible enough to the point that you could figure out the meaning of a word, even with the context and knowing every other word, meaning the sentence is I+1, then you wouldn't have this problem. So that means that the thing you're trying to understand is actually above your reach, maybe more than you had previously thought. It's possible that there's a form of something that you know that doesn't make sense at all. It's like the example with the passive form of kotowaru as kotowarareru. So for example, the sentence might be kare ni kotowarareta. But even if you know that kare means he and kotowaru means to reject, you might not be fully aware that kotowaru is using its passive form kotowarareru, and that it doesn't mean that he was rejected, but rather something was rejected by him. So as always, I hope you guys found value from this video. Big shout out to my Patreon subs for supporting. If you want to support, we have a private Discord and a bunch of guides and resources on Patreon. So with all that said, それじゃまたね.